I first became aware of Edward Bawden's work really when I was a student at the Slade in the 1950s. And this was because one of my tutors was Linton who was a friend of Edward Bawden, being a fellow illustrator and also a fellow designer and draftsman at the Curwen Press. The Curwen Studio was set up in 1958, but the idea for it came earlier through the thinking of Robert Erskine, who had the St. George's Gallery in Cork Street. And he was friendly with Timothy Simon, one of the directors of the Curwen Press. They both had different needs. One was that in this country there weren't facilities for artists to make work with printers who could produce lithography to the standard that was done on the continent. This was a special form of collaborative printmaking, which involved the artist making and drawing the image with the printers so that these could be called original prints. This was a different form of lithography to what the Curwen Press could produce at that time. The Curwen Press was skilled enormously in commercial lithographic methods. But this way of working with an artist, artists of different concepts, different ideas, was something that was very much tied to continental practice. What Robert Erskine wanted to do was to have facilities in this country which could provide him, as a publisher, with work of the correct standard for international publication. And the idea of a studio run by the Curwen Press appealed because it also brought artists back again to the Curwen Press, which had somehow, during World War II, lost that connection. Edward did not come for many years, actually, because he was tied up really with doing a lot of lino block printing and work for other publishers. I actually came to work with him first over some book illustrations that had been commissioned to do at the Curwen Press. And it was on that level that he saw how the work was being done on stone and plate. But it was only after we'd moved the studio into Tottenham Court Road, we moved in 1965, that he came on the commissioning of Herbert Simon to do this series of London markets. What Tom is doing at the moment is to get the viscosity and the density of the ink suitably applied to the block so that when we use the transfer film, it will in fact convey the right amount of imagery and not be over-inked or spoil Edward's original cut lino. The early days of the Curwen Studio were very experimental because it was separate from the main body of the Curwen Press, and it was meant to be a place where artists could develop their ideas using more or less modern technologies of making lithography. And the artists who came were sent not only by Robert Erskine, but by other galleries who were anxious to have their artists become practiced in the business of making their own prints. Now, this list begins with Henry Moore. Henry Moore was at that time making a book with the Curwen Press called Heads, Figures and Ideas, and it had been published by George Rainbird. In it were one or two special drawings and prints that were part of the deluxe edition. Now it so happened that some of those plates used in the printing of that book, Henry used in the making of his first lithograph in the Curwen Studio. The next stage is the placing of the sheet of transfer paper onto the block, and then Tom will actually apply pressure to make sure that sufficient ink comes from it onto the paper. It's a baren, Japanese tool that's used in woodblock printing. We're using it here. What it is, it's a bamboo leaf coiled into a shape that fits the hand, and it's soft enough and has enough texture to actually do that particular work. You can make them out of all kinds of things, but the bamboo leaf is one of the most classical ones to use. In those days, a lot of the artists had become personal friends of Oliver Simon and Herbert Simon. So the business of actually producing a special publication was almost, on Herbert's part, an act of interest and friendship. He greatly admired Edward's work, as you can gather.
Is that looking all right?
Yep. That's it. You note the speckled nature of the ink, which is what Edward would like particularly. That's it, Tom? Okay. I had known Robert Erskine as a student. He used to show my work in his gallery. And the idea of having a studio in this country that actually would produce work of comparable standards to those achieved in Paris was often a subject of conversation between him and myself. When I finished my student days at the Slade, I managed to get 2 small scholarships which got me across the Channel with the idea of learning in a Parisian studio the craft and the practice of lithographic printing to a higher standard than what one could obtain in this country. And it was this way that I came into contact with Patrice, the man who ran Atelier Patrice in Montparnasse. This was largely through S.W. Hayter, the engraver, who very kindly introduced me to this skilled lithographer. After a great deal of discussion, it was agreed that I should become a kind of apprentice to him and also be able to do my own work. And this arrangement carried on for a year, after which he said to me, "You are good enough to help me in the studio. You will be my partner for the foreseeable future." And this is how I became part of his establishment. Quite unusual, because in those days people could not get access to studios of that kind because of the secrets of print making that the printers liked to keep to themselves. But I was allowed into this coterie, if you like, and there I met a lot of the School of Paris artists and was able to work with them and make friends with them. And it was a very energizing time because we had to print long editions on stone, all by hand, no mechanized machinery. And this meant us working in competition with companies like Mourlot and de Jaubert, who were very well established and had their own field of artists like Picasso and Braque and so on. So there's a great deal of competitive printmaking being done in the studios in Paris at that time. After examination, the sheet is taken off completely, revealing Edward's image transferred onto the metal. Largely because of the method of production, because at that time Edward was very keen to use the qualities he'd been accustomed to with lino block printing. And the lino block, for him, had specific qualities of texture and design that appealed to him. And he was quite intrigued about this method, which was unique, really, to his prints, particularly this series of the markets. And the idea was that those qualities should be preserved in the making of the lithographs. So he evolved a system of transferring the images from the block to the printing plate so that Edward could, if necessary, make alterations to the zinc plates from which the lithographs would be printed. The blocks were cut in his own studio. He would do the groundwork and formulate the design, but before he would actually do anything lithographically, he made sure that Herbert Simon approved the images, because he, as publisher, had that right. So there was discussion and approval at that stage. And then the blocks were brought into the studio in Tottenham Court Road, and the process of transferring would then begin with Edward sometimes present, sometimes not. At that time he was also doing teaching at the Royal College, so it was convenient for him to coincide his visits to the studio with a day's teaching at the Royal College. You can see the ink lying proud above the surface of the plate. This image will be washed away during the processing of the plate, and underneath will be the lithographic printing base on which the machine will print the colour. Because the ink is still wet, we're going to dust the surface of the plate with French chalk, which will enable Tom to gum the plate satisfactorily without disturbing the surface of the drawing. I think the difference is basically that Edward was very experienced as a printmaker and very specific in the ways in which he wanted to make these images. There are many, many methods of applying the gum coating. We use very soft sponges, which helps to get the solution into the grain of the plate more satisfactorily than cloth, actually. Nowadays at the studio we use electric heaters to dry the gum, but in days even before my time, people used to use this to actually dry the gum coating. This is the flag, as it was called, for doing that particular process. Images. Now, a lot of artists that come to the studio arrive with no particular idea in mind before they set to work on the print. In other words, it's a question of attitude of mind as much as anything. And this varies from artist to artist. Some artists come, like Edward did, with particular drawn information, watercolours, or sometimes a painting, or even photography. Other artists will begin by making the image directly onto the stone or plate. And this varies according to the kind of artist that you're dealing with. As the turpentine does its work, it dissolves the ink that we applied from the block, and you can see the nature of the work underneath. At this point, a lot of artists look despairingly at what has happened to their drawing. So the staff has to be consistently able to cope with all kinds of artists. Shall I do the damping for you, Tom?
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Yes, this is a rolling up black ink, which brings the image back out to the plate again. So the asphalting stage that we did a moment ago makes the image very greasy, and the ink being very greasy, the two stick to each other. And Stanley wetting the plate there, the water repels away from the grease, you see. So if you let the plate dry out here, the ink will stick on the dry parts of the plate and fill in.
Now I say that because this studio does not have a house style. If you look at a lot of the printing done in the 1930s and 40s by commercial houses, you can see which printing company did the work, because they were all taught to print in particular ways. Lithography is one of these printmaking processes that takes no prisoners. If you get your chemistry wrong, or if you get your viscosities wrong, or if you do one process instead of doing another, you're likely to lose the image. So it is key that you follow consistently processing methods, because there are many of them. You can read books, you can try your own experiments and so on, but in essence it's a very possessive craft as regards technology. How long did Edward take to complete the series of markets? This is one example. There are 5 others that were in the series, and it took a matter of a year, not constant working but intermittent working, in the studio in Midford Place. He would come having produced number 1 or number 3 and bring the image in a large hold-all, the lino blocks, the colour swatches, those are the colour notes that he wanted to appear in the work, and we would spend best part of a day, if he could spare it. If he was teaching, he would go and do his teaching and come back in the evening, and we would spend time going through the logistics of how these blocks of lino would fit together and the kinds of colour variations that he would like to see. You see, with this method of proofing, as it's called, not only do you have the image, the artist's idea, which he would often produce as a lino cut. He would show me this and say, this is how I want the finished lithograph to look like. And we will discuss the methods by which alterations could be made, if necessary, when the zinc printing plates were being made. So this was very much a discussion time at the point before we made the printing plates. We had to clear the understanding of what he wanted and the accidents that happen, should they be kept or should they be taken out, because artists are very fond of taking advantage of creative accidents, and Edward was no exception.
So, it's washing out again with terps, the same as we did before. Because the transfer is quite fresh, the image needs a little bit of extra protection, if you like. If you start too quickly, the image can suffer a bit and start printing incorrectly. So it's just another really thin layer of asphaltum going on again.
We've had in the past other artists who have used lino cutting, but not in the way Edward did, because Edward actually took great interest in the making of the images and the blocks and cut them himself for this particular series. Other artists, like Michael Rothenstein, involved lino cutting sometimes as part of his lithograph, so you get a combination of the actual lino cut and the lithograph. But Edward didn't do that. Edward kept the lino cut as a separate activity, and the lithographs are what you see here. If you look at the block, you'll see the cutting method that Edward used in isolating the important parts of the image. The close-up will show the use of broad-edged tools, which he himself would have done. He didn't have an assistant at this stage to cut the blocks. Largely in Tottenham Court Road. Occasionally, if Edward was visiting the Curwen press, he would come in to the studio, which was situated further down St Mary's Road, and have a look, have a chat, and see what was being done by other artists. He was always keen to see what was going on. His son Richard also did work with us at the Curwen press in, first of all in Plaistow, and then in Tottenham Court Road when the studio was doing a special series under Robert Simon's publication. So you had that family connection of both artists working for us. But largely, this was the most important project that he did with us. So what we had was a year spent in him producing the blocks at home, coming to the studio, having discussions, seeing the work proofed out. Now, when I say proofed out lithographically, we had a machine, we've got them here. These machines are for making the actual image that the artist will see before the edition is printed. This is what the artist looks at, makes comments on, and signs if he's quite happy with that result. And this occurred with Edward as well. He was able to take proofs home and also to show Herbert Simon, who was the publisher. So the approval came in that way.
The inks we use here are kind of all archival and as light fast as you can get. And this is oil-based ink, so very greasy in nature. Let's see, I'll lift it back up again. It's gone through the whole set of rollers all the way down to the bottom here. So I'm just taking off the gum and the excess asphalt and cleaning the plate basically. And you can see if you light on there, you can see the water repelling against the image there. You can see how that repels.
Sometimes an artist will come and say, if he's there, can you warm that colour a little bit, or can you cool it down, or can you make it more translucent, even before the edition is printed? So he or she has complete control over what is produced as the original print. I think it may well have done, because Edward worked for other publishers, and Editions Electo was a very forthright company for employing contemporary artists to make original work. And in a sense, they were rivals to the Curwen Press, but that's a good thing because it produces cutting-edge work in all senses of the term. And Edward would no doubt have benefited from working there in some form or other, as he did working at the Curwen Studio. No, he worked on other prints at the Curwen Studio. We were solitary in producing this particular series, but he brought other printing work to the studio. He actually produced what were in effect ideas from the watercolours that he did during World War II, and those were printed and can be seen in edition form as hand-drawn lithography, as well as book illustrations that he did for other publishers. Well, Edward's influence is widespread, and you can see that in a lot of artists in this country. And certainly those artists that come here pay homage to him as an important figure, creative artist, with Eric Revilius in the 1920s and 30s of considerable importance, no doubt about that. To complete this demonstration, I think it's important to point out that compositionally this has been printed with the pillars on the left-hand side. Our example is with the pillars on the right-hand side, and the reason is the logistics of using different machinery in the re-transfer process. This particular print we chose is the remaining block of this subject, Billingsgate Fish Market, the old fish market. And what you can see here is the grey structure, the architectural linear patterning, and the use of his line in figure composition. On top of this, you see areas of colour which actually are not just filling in the line, but they're actually balanced with other colours to form the final print. These translucent colours were printed on top of that example that we have here. Thank you very much.